What's up, friends? Welcome back to Rooted Wisconsin. Appreciate you for clicking another episode. Grateful to have you here. Today's episode is with Jeff Pritzl, deer specialist from the Wisconsin DNR. I guess I should say former deer specialist from the Wisconsin DNR because Jeff is retiring. Super excited to share the conversation. We're on the heels of another Wisconsin deer season, and of course, that's what we talk a lot about. We talk about deer herd management, conservation, our mutual appreciation of Aldo Leopold and the Sand County Almanac, and a whole lot more. Really fascinating to catch Jeff at this point of his career. He had a long history with the DNR and grew into different roles, and he never expected to be the deer specialist at the Wisconsin DNR. So it was great talking about his journey. It was so fun talking about both projecting the future of the Wisconsin deer herd, what deer hunting culture means in Wisconsin, and what he hopes to continue as he forges off into retirement, but wants to continue to share his passion around it. Big shout out to our sponsors, as always, Carouser, bringing you a non-alcoholic option to all of your events as we head into a new year. If limiting or removing drinking from your life is one of your goals, Carouser can help you get there with a social beverage that isn't alcohol. Vitamins, minerals, no hangovers the next day. Carouser.com. Check them out. Shipping non-alcoholic beverages, social replacements right to your door. Also, a huge shout out to our newer sponsor, Epic Mortgage. Had a chance to talk with their group as they came on board as partners, and really encouraging to see the focus on people that they have in relationships and what that means in the home buying process. Buying a house isn't easy, especially right now, and it's good to have an expert in your corner. The folks at Epic Mortgage can be that for you. And you can see I'm sporting some new Rooted Wisconsin apparel made by Genuine Lynn, a colleague of mine and his wife's business, who is Genuine Lynn, doing a lot of cool stuff. They've got a really neat model going where one of the things she does is serves a lot of school districts with their own shop where people can come and buy branded apparel for school sports teams consistently. It doesn't have to be one big order. She can have the shop and make the branded apparel, and you can order it and she'll make it as the orders come in. Genuine Lynn, scope it out, tagged in the copy below here. And as we head into a new year, I also want to thank you for being here with us. Really excited to embark on another year of Rooted Wisconsin, and really happy you're taking the journey with us, kicking it off with a bang here with Jeff, and a lot of cool stuff to come. So appreciate you being here. Without further ado, let's get it moving. Jeff Pritzl.
As the years have passed, so have the ways. We've tried to lift our neighbors. Where did the love go? Where did the talk end? We need some help to make this better again.
So, how I used to start, I used to do this intro right into this camera, and then I would come to the guest, and then everybody would get all nervous and stuff. So now we just kind of start talking, and we'll just cut the episode start where it goes. But I don't know. You said the last one was the one you were on. You were surprised it went 3 hours or close to that or something.
I did. That one pushed almost 3 hours, and that's when I like. And there was people that spent 3 hours while consuming it. So
yeah,
and there's a few that I like to follow that they tend to run 2.5 hours, and those are ones if you're on a long drive.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's when I take most of my pods in. Is driving. It passes the time so quickly. Yeah. I like two people. Sometimes I'll listen to three. You ever listen to the Meat Eater guys? You ever listen to their pod?
Yeah. Yeah.
I love it. Like I love Renella's content. I think it's good. All those guys do such a good job. But the Meat Eater podcast, when they get like 5 or 6 people around the table, I can't keep up. I can't keep up with who's saying what, and I get a little confused. I still want to. I haven't listened to the whole one where they had a really good CWD talk 2 months ago or 3 months ago. Have you listened to that one yet?
I have the last couple of months I've been kind of preoccupied with some other stuff, so I haven't been keeping up on their regular podcast. I'm a regular for Ryan Callahan's weekly thing because it's easy, you know, and that one you can do in a half an hour. But what captured me early on with Meat Eater was Steve's ability. They would bring some agency people on, and he was really good at creating a situation where they could talk candidly about what was going on behind the scenes in the agencies and doing it in a way that it was engaging. And I was like, this is great stuff that he's creating this platform where people can see, you know, the agency folks in a more of a real term. And I just, again, the conversations, the content, the way they set it up, I was just like, thanks for giving the agencies that platform for people to see them in that light.
100%. Yeah. I used to, this is a while ago now, but I had a podcast called Wishigan Outdoors. It was on traditional radio, but we also would record it and put it online. And we would do the same. We would have a lot of agents on Wishigan. It was in the UP, so Michigan and Wisconsin. And I think closing that gap is super important, right? The one you're talking about of like this perception versus reality. And I don't know, maybe that's a cool place to start today. You've had a long career in the DNR.
Yeah. And
I think there's less of that gap that exists than people think, right? Like, I mean, what led you to a career in the DNR? Let's start there.
Well, I think it was kind of the classic. I grew up in the 70s and early 80s, and a lot of us youngsters aspired to be like our dads and grandpas and uncles, that a lot of them were, you know, hunting and fishing and that kind of stuff. And I just remember spending time as a kid in my grandfather's basement, literally just kind of like going through his hunting clothes and the smell of the gun cabinet and just going, someday that's going to be me, you know? And so you generated the sense of that's your evolution, and it played out for me. And so my grandfather was my main mentor in terms of exposure to hunting and fishing and all those kind of things. And I just couldn't get enough of it. But it when I think about it, it went even earlier than that. My mom really cultivated an appreciation for nature above and beyond just the hook and bullet stuff, you know, the hunting and fishing and, you know, bird watching. And I remember as a grade schooler, literally like reading Peterson's Field Guide of birds from front to back as a book. And I, you know, so I really got into birding and the whole checklist thing of seeing what you could see. So I had that going too, but then the hunting and fishing stuff, you know, was really flourishing. And I just was fortunate that I grew up in central Wisconsin in Marshfield. So it's just a hop skip from Stevens Point. My mother was a alumni of UW Point as a teacher. And so I was aware of Stevens Point, and as soon as I found out they had a College of Natural Resources, I was just like, oh boy. And I some freshman assignment to, hey, you got to write to a university and get their catalog and get just thinking about stuff. So I wrote to Point and got their catalog. And so I was a freshman in high school, and I was like, I'm going to Stevens Point, going to College of Natural Resources. And a lot of people kind of start on that path, as you would with any, you know, aspiration to go into school, and your path changes. And for me, it just, everything kind of kept falling into place, and stayed with the wildlife conservation career. As a freshman, you know, they require you to read Sand County Almanac from Aldo Leopold, and that just super resonated with me. And so you get this feedback of, oh yeah, I'm on the right path. But yeah, I have to credit my mom for cultivating that appreciation for nature in general, and my grandpa. And so then it was, and I've mentioned this a couple of times recently as I reflect back on what set me on this path. But he took me. We deer hunted in central Wisconsin for the most part, but he had a connection up in northwest Wisconsin in Bayfield County where he trout fished. And he was like, oh, I just wanted to go up there and deer hunt. And so he took me as a 15-year-old up there. And it was one of these days where, and I really, we didn't see much for deer. And I was cold, and it was back when we had winter during deer season. Yeah. But it was opening afternoon, and this little buck came down the trail, and we didn't have any antlerless permits, and so it had to be a buck. And I ended up killing this deer It was the only deer any of us saw the entire weekend. And it was under circumstances that I think back now with what I know, I'm like, none of that should have ever happened. So that makes it even more of like, that was a meant to be situation. And when I killed that deer, it was in a kind of a awakening or epiphany that a 15-year-old could have at the time, was that, this isn't just a target. This is serious stuff. I just took a life of an animal that's about the same size as me.
Mm-hmm.
And some people at that point, I think, would go, ooh, I can't do that. And that's fine. There's a lot of people that would be the reaction. Within my own family, I've seen that, where they've tried it and they're like, ugh, no. But that's not what happened to me. For me, it was like, this is a commitment that if I'm going to do this, and I do want to keep doing this, but this isn't just fun and games.
Mm-hmm.
And so coming from that, that sense of, and I was always like, that deer, it's, almost a spiritual experience.
Oh, it's heavy.
And it became inspiration, and that really kind of set me on that path. And so being able to have something like that and reflect on it and always be reminded of, this is why you're doing that. And then the opportunity to share that with other people and have them think about, try to bring things that might be in their subconscious. Like, I really like doing this, but I don't know necessarily why. It just resonates with me. And well, let's explore. Here's why. And these are the things that are happening. And then the collective benefits of helping people understand how to live more connected to the land, which is what Leopold was trying to instill, 100 years ago now almost.
Mm-hmm.
And it just became, pretty easy to follow that path. And I was fortunate that everything fell into place.
Yeah. A lot of times when you follow a passion, a lot of stuff gets written for you. It just kind of doors open when you follow things passionately. There's so many good points in there though. I've talked about this a couple times on the pod. I have a 4-year-old, and last year I had a really good opening day. So I was done early and I got a chance to, it would fit in his schedule. He could come out and see the deer afterwards. And we've talked about it a lot since. And I think there's a human nature element that, I don't know, some people may lose as a hunter along the way of that thing you were just saying. It's really heavy to take a life, and I'll never forget like our conversation. I was really intentional about it with him, about the gratitude that I have for the animal and how this is a melancholy feeling. Like I taught my 4-year-old what melancholy means.
Yeah.
And that is, it's part of it. It's part of it that it probably does. Maybe I'm sure it's pointed people in other directions and said, I don't want to do this again. This isn't something, and that's fine. But I think there's even a deeper level for me that I can think back to a lot of conversations I've had about people asking like, well, what gives you, true satisfaction? Where do you feel happy and content? And almost always for me, if it's not like a family scenario when like obviously when I'm with my family, I feel connected and involved and human, but it's lost in the wilderness, man. That's where I feel the most alive.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I'm always chasing, no matter if I'm deer hunting or trout fishing or going on a hike or bird watching or doing whatever. It's being connected to the outdoors. And it's awesome that you, it sounds like you kind of recognized that pretty early. It took me a while to realize why I did it.
Well, yeah. And there was this sense of, you noticed that your senses kick in at a level that nothing else makes my hearing and my sight and everything so upfront. And I remember I've had that experience a couple times. Like, I think that's why the opening day of archery season is so popular. It's not so much that anyone's like, especially archers, they're not out to get in and get out quickly. It's like, I don't really want to film my tag on opening day, but I want to feel that feeling on opening day. And so you climb into the stand and you're sitting there and you're watching the world wake up. And it's like, oh yeah, I haven't used my ears and my eyes in this way in months. And I missed it, and so just that sense of, that's part of that that connection.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to think of the all day sits during the rut as an 8-hour meditation. Like it's just an 8-hour time to sit there with your thoughts. It's easy to scroll. I try not to scroll. I try to get involved in the woods and in my surroundings. And the senses are a huge part of it. And I think there's something built inside of us that like human nature says that for me, at least, it's something integral to my existence.
Sure.
I have to do it sometimes. I have to be there. It's funny you say that. I actually just saw I saw a video yesterday or the day before of a Northeast Wisconsin content creator, and she posts a lot of hunting content. And she was talking about how much she learned about her partner in hunting with him as a couple. And I thought that was a really unique angle on it. Something I had never thought of. To me, the camaraderie of hunting is cool. I spend a lot of time with my dad. That's some of our core memories with my dad.
Sure. Yeah.
But at the same time, so much of hunting for me has been alone in the woods. And I thought about it in a different way, about past the camaraderie, but what you can see in a human when you're out there hunting. And I think that's what I'm hearing from you. That's awesome. So like a lot of time in the DNR, you've had several different roles, and you've been in the current one that you're retiring now from for like 5 years, right?
Yeah, it would have been 5 years in a couple months here if I wasn't winding down.
Yeah. And you said you were kind of a waterfowler before that, right?
Yeah, that was what got me into it. Was going back to my grandfather, he was waterfowl hunting was his main thing, and we deer hunted because that was culturally the whole family got together and we deer hunted for venison. It wasn't and this is the 1970s and 80s again, and for the most part, it's interesting, we were turning the deer population over very quickly back in those days because hunters were more opportunistic.
Yep.
But waterfowling was the thing we shared, and I just had that connection to it. So when I went to school at Stevens Point, I focused on that. And then, the first position I got with the department, it happened to be, on the East Coast. I've been in Manitowoc County my entire career. And I grew up in central Wisconsin. I got real connected to the state properties that were out my back door, the Mead Wildlife area and McMillan Marsh, which is right on the north edge of Marshfield. So I had that very accessible to me. And so that was so I really got that appreciation for public land as well then. And then when I was fortunate enough to get stationed in Manitowoc County, there's a state property there called Collins Marsh that is a big waterfowl management area. So yeah, that was my gig for the first half of my career. And in the 1990s, it was a great time to be a waterfowl and wetland habitat specialist, because that was the Farm Bill had just kicked in, and there was a lot of conservation reserves set aside going on. There was a bunch of ag land being taken out of production, some of it permanently, but some of it was temporary. But we got to do a lot of habitat restoration because of those programs that were around in the 1990s. And so that's one of the things I can now sit back, I can go on the landscape and go, I had something to do with why that looks like that now. And that's, of course, really rewarding and fulfilling. But then when I moved into supervision in the Northeast area here in Green Bay, that's where if you would have asked me back then, you're going to run the deer program someday, I'd have said, you're crazy. You're kidding, and because there is this element specific to deer that just comes with this I don't want to call it baggage, but this expectation that it's controversial, you never please everybody or anybody. But when I started having to do the deer stuff, at first it was uncomfortable, but then as I got into it more and I really started to watch and see what was playing out, again, not so much from the biological and ecological side of it, but as we were just talking about, deer hunting is such a cultural, part of the fabric of Wisconsin, and so many people are connected to it. But what comes with that and this aspect of, traditions, of preconceived notions of, this is the way it's supposed to be. But I was, from my position, I'm getting this feedback from all these different angles and seeing that, no, that's not the case at all. There's a tremendous diversity of what's going on out there. And that's okay. And then when the opportunity came later in my career, to me, it felt like an encore career within my career. It was like, all right, at this point, there was a need for the deer position came open. For most of my career, it was a position that was required to be in Madison. And in today's world, that's all changed. And part of the fact that I was able to do it from the Green Bay area and I didn't have to relocate to Madison made it possible. And then I already had a couple of decades of exposure and awareness in Northeast Wisconsin. And this part of the state has just always embraced that outdoor lifestyle. I think at a little bit of a level more than, not that we don't statewide, but I remember a couple of years ago, there was a article or a survey or something, and it was like one of the greatest places in the country for an outdoorsman to live, and the Fox Valley was like number one, just because there's so many options within short driving distance, of this area. So I was fortunate to be in this area. And then, I want to see if I can take on some of these, the challenges that are associated with, deer management in Wisconsin, which aren't so much about the deer, but it's the deer hunter. It's us.
Absolutely, yeah. Two things in there that I was planning to talk about today. Awesome segues. First, we'll save the next one might be a deer hunting rabbit hole, so we'll get there. But the pressures of the role, that had to be interesting. I envision 5 years of just trying to please the unpleasable. That's what I think of. Like it had to feel like that at times, right? Like you of course you're not going to please anybody, but man, when people care about something, opinions become charged. And then with that, along with the diversity of opinions that exist, at times, did it feel like that? Did it feel like it's just, what would you say? Like, did you aim to, I guess, appease a certain percentage or try to make the most people happy? Or like, how does that even work? You had to feel pressures at times, right?
Sure. But so the main thing I always thought about in terms of that wasn't necessarily appease people, but definitely have people come away from their interaction feeling heard. And I think that's where this default thought of that this is a fight, this is an argument, this is taking that you don't believe me and I don't believe you, and my job is to convince you that you're wrong. Yeah. That plays out in a lot of arenas, right? But and it certainly played out in the deer role. But to be able to say, I'm not challenging, you're not wrong, but now let's talk about why you're experiencing what you're experiencing and how and why things are the way they are. And that I want you to understand that, this isn't you're trying to, change the way we're doing things, or I want you to do it differently. But if you're aware of why things are the way they are, we can maybe have a better conversation. And I've had plenty of long phone calls with people that were difficult, that at the end was hey, thanks for listening. I really appreciate it. I know you can't please everybody. And I just appreciate that I had a chance that it feels like you heard where I'm coming from. And then I put that in the context of the reality when you've got 600,000 people that are interested in something. And I've said this, in a number of ways that, even if I had a 90% satisfaction rate, which I don't pretend to have anything near that, even if I did, that's still 60,000 people that are not happy and are going to want something different. And it's obviously much bigger than that. So even under the best of circumstances, you're going to have tens of thousands of people that unfortunately are coming. And so that's just a reality that so treating that as how are we going to fix that and make it go away? You're never going to. So it's like, how do you, just foster conversation so they can understand why they're experiencing the experience that they're having, and not to try to diminish it and say that, well, you're just not doing it right or whatever. But it's that diversity of experiences and diversity of expectations. It really comes down to expectations a lot of ways. And that's where we always struggled within the agency of how do we temper or manage expectations, because it's natural within the media coverage of this. It's just, to me, and that's part of growing up in the Green Bay area or working in the Green Bay area, the analogies to our passions for the Packers and sports and stuff like that. People's enthusiasm for that gets expressed in attention to following the statistics and then talking about the statistics. And we use the term Monday morning quarterbacking all the time, in the world of, football. And that same thing plays out, in deer hunting because there is that passion and enthusiasm. And I always told my staff that passion is a double-edged sword because it generates energy and drive and enthusiasm, which is great, but it also can generate tunnel vision because you become so focused on it's this or nothing. And because collectively in the state, if you looked at those statistics, they're really pretty good, but you're still going to have tens of thousands of outliers. And so it's always going to generate that sense of, what are you talking about? I'm not experiencing that, and I want to, and that's understandable. But that's where I always kind of cringe when we talk about, there's 2 million deer on the landscape in Wisconsin, because that right away it generates this expectation, there's deer everywhere. But one of the challenges with it that's always been is that those animals are very unevenly distributed on the landscape, and there's going to be even in the counties like Wapaka and Shawano and south of there, where if you looked at our overall like deer killed per square mile, it's some of the best in the country. But there's people in those counties that are not having good deer hunting experiences, and there's many different reasons for that. But all 600,000 of us can't be hunting on optimal, deer country. Every square mile isn't created the same, for deer, and so that's one of the things that makes it interesting. And then it always there's this scale of, we look at it on a very large scale, a county, hundreds of square miles and tens of thousands of deer. That's the scale that we're managing, and that the individual hunters experiences a square mile and maybe a couple square miles scattered around. But when we talk about averages, oftentimes it doesn't reflect what you've got individuals on either end of that spectrum oftentimes. And so having that conversation and acknowledging that, just kind of helps. Okay. Going back to what you said earlier about, you'll never please everybody, and having that as an objective is unrealistic.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And I mean, even the diversity of how you approach something as a deer hunter. I mean, there's people that'll go to a new spot every single time. If they're a public land hunter, they'll, they're cool beating 4 miles of brush, and they'll go to a new spot every time. And then compare that to the opinion of a person who walks to the same deer stand from September 25th or whatever till the end of gun season. Like, even that and the understanding about how they approach the craft leads to such different expectations and experiences throughout it. So I thought that was fascinating. That's one thing that really I've appreciated with you since you took the role. I think you've done a great job of being that conduit, that pragmatic voice of saying, like, okay, this isn't the same for everybody. It's cool if there's, all these deer in this area of the state and there's less in this state. That's just how it is. And we have to manage it effectively. But I think the communication piece of you mentioned people being heard earlier. That's such an important thing of just like finding that common ground, like sometimes people just want to have their voice out there and know that. Yeah. That's awesome. Yep. Second thing you had mentioned, and there might get us into a little bit more X's and O's, but you talked about how deer hunters have overall become a little bit more selective and less opportunistic. I just had a funny conversation the other day. I was talking about my hunting camp growing up, and I had an uncle that his goal was to fill every tag he had as quickly as he could. So he would go to the stand, and if he had the opportunity to fill his 3 tags, at that time it was probably a buck and 2 doe tags. What if something brown walked in front of him, it was in danger. It was going to be harvested. I noticed as of late, it seems like there's almost some communication to maybe push hunters back in that direction a little bit. What has that mindset done to the population, and how has that changed deer management in Wisconsin over the years?
Yeah, that is a rabbit hole.
Such a big rabbit hole, yeah.
But it's a good one, and it's an important one for people to understand because, again, there's this embedded and ingrained sense of tradition associated with the hunt, right? And part of that becomes this is the way it was as I was introduced to it, and I fell in love with that way, and I wanted to always stay that way. And it never does. And whether we get into the discussion of what's happened to the traditional deer camp in the north versus what's happened in the southern half of the state, and how these shifting baselines of expectations, or there should be, over the course of time. But to the question of what's changed in terms of how it affected deer management, is it really has been a challenge that's gotten more challenging, because what we've seen over the course of decades is certainly a shift towards deer hunting on private land as opposed to public land. And quite honestly, in private landowners, especially if they're landowners for the sake of deer hunting, they're managing their own experience, and they're going to, we give them sideboards, but they're going to do things as they are comfortable with, based on their objectives and what they've learned over the years. But if we look at just the harvest statistics, that you said that those folks are still out that do take an opportunistic approach, but they're the minority, and their impact, and there's still this perception that, well, in general, if you give hunters the opportunity, they're going to take it, and the risk of over-exploiting the resource is real. And the system that we work within, that we've had for decades and decades, was built under the premise of protecting the resource from over-exploitation, from opportunistic, overzealous harvesters. And that really is rooted way back into the market hunting days, the 1800s, and the subsistence living that did result in the eradication of critters, to the degree that we're still, like, the system is built to make sure that doesn't happen again. But we still operate from that perspective, to the degree that we're probably overly cautious that, we don't want to, cause over-exploitation. But when we look at the harvest records, and hunters making their own decision as to whether or not to pull the trigger in a given situation, we certainly see a trend towards self-corrections and being more self-selecting. And although there are the hunters that, we can look in our statistics, and they may take 3, 4, 5 deer in a year, they are such a small portion of the total that it's almost not influential at that level. I mean, what we see is first of all, we have to take the 600,000 hunters and carve out just what we would call the successful portion of that, which isn't the same every year. I mean, some of them it is. And when we think about, going back to, you were bringing up the idea that we've been maybe promoting additional harvest. We're not talking about or to everybody. We're talking to that subset of hunters that are very fortunate, that are well positioned to have access to deer, to the degree that, they're going to get a deer when they want to get a deer. And what we do know about that subset is, once they get a deer, they become very selective of whether they're going to get an additional deer or not. And so that's where the opportunity lies to, increase deer harvest, if that subset feels like they have a legitimate, responsible venue or path for those deer to go and be utilized, because, like, our needs are met, we're done. But there's a whole bunch of people that whose needs aren't being met, and you're in the fortunate position to maybe help them out. And there's a couple of different ways to go about that. But one of the we talked earlier about the scale of, I could look at County X and say, we need to take 4,000 antlerless deer out of this county. And historically, we've only been taking 2,000 antlerless deer. So how are we going to get those other 2,000 antlerless deer? And you can't say to everybody, hey, kill a couple more thousand deer, because some of them will be like, I would if I could. I just don't have that opportunity, and that makes me uncomfortable that you're promoting this to others. Yep. But the reality is there are others that do, and and you can either say, all right, well, maybe bring a few other people in that would be happy to take an antlerless deer for venison, or just take one extra deer and have pre-planned what's going to happen with that deer, whether it's going to go into the formal deer donation program or just your own personal network. And when I start thinking about that, I think about how hunters, literally for thousands of years, the hunters were a subset of the community, and they hunted for the community as a whole. And as we were talking about earlier, hunting has become a very personal experience and a very individual experience. And that's great and fine for all the things we were talking about earlier, but there is an important role for that portion of the hunting community that is fortunate and has access to maybe take that approach of it's a win-win if I could, take that approach of hunting for my community. And then you end up having those individual discussions with landowners or a group of people that have their objectives and what's their comfort level of increasing deer harvest. Is it going to improve their experience in the future, or do they see that as a potential concern? And the other thing I've observed is when we do talk about liberalizing opportunity, for a number of different reasons, again, for us at the big scale, big picture level, it's about keeping people hunting, we've talked quite a bit the last couple of years about how we're losing hunter numbers overall, but how can we keep this, simpler and just make it more open? For that group of hunters that unfortunately find themselves not having their experience fulfilled, they approach that with, well, you're going to let these people over here take too many deer. That's going to have I'm never going to get to catch up to them with that experience if you're letting them over there, take more deer. But yet the factors that are causing it not to be playing out well for you, that may not be what the driving force is. We could say, okay, you guys can't shoot any more deer until these guys over here have better deer hunting. And that may never happen.
Right. Yeah. It's not like the deer are going to go walking over there.
Yeah. So in the meantime, and then there's all kinds of discussions we can go in with that as far as, well, everyone's like, well, how can I improve my odds? And there's plenty of conversation about that. I mean, in the worlds of, how do you manage your property to make it better for the deer, which is great. But if everybody's doing that collectively, there's a point where it's like, oh, we've made it so good for the deer that it can end up having a negative impact on deer movement on the landscape and those types of things. So that's the part where, we can get into those conversations. And it's our system has been, again, built for so long that it's based on the annual allocation of antlerless harvest opportunity as the mechanism by which we steer the direction of the deer population. And that worked in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. But in the 1990s, there were some things that really changed that we have seen now over the last couple of decades, that we still live with this strong sense of we can manifest our destiny, by manipulating harvest opportunity, but it's really playing out at a different level now. Again, with the predominance of how people are choosing to, especially on private land, manage their deer harvest. So there's great conversations to have if we can make room for it by maybe reducing the focus on, well, just how many antlerless permits are we going to make available, and put a lot of time and effort into that, when that in and of itself probably doesn't have the punch that it once did. And so that's the stuff I've kind of enjoyed cultivating over the last number of years.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about, because I think that makes complete sense. Like, you could give everybody 10 antlerless tags. If 2% of them get filled, it doesn't do anything, It's super interesting. What about that decline in numbers? That's something I've thought about a little bit, more than a little bit, actually.
Sure.
The reasoning behind it and what we as outdoorsmen can do to share the passion. I see a lot of pockets that I think are going to be an upward trajectory of, younger people. They have platforms now to share their experience, where maybe someone can learn how to bow hunt on YouTube now. Bow hunting is a very difficult thing. If you want to be successful, it's pretty tough, especially if you try doing it yourself. Like, just buying a bow and learning how to shoot it and going out and on some
Right.
public land. It's going to take a while for you to feel it out, especially without somebody kind of showing you the ropes. I think that's one thing that's going to push it in a good direction. Before we hopped on, we talked about the folks from the hunting public doing awesome content and like people like that. Okayest Hunter, I've been checking their stuff out down outside of Milwaukee. Just like sharing the passion, I think will hopefully ignite some flames of people that don't have avenues to the outdoors. But I mean, that's been around for a while, and I still hear the declining number conversation. And that's concerning, really, if you forecast out long term, because like hunters' dollars feed conservation and push conservation forward in so many different ways. And if that continues to compress, opportunists from other areas that have more, other vested interests and stuff can lead to differing outcomes of what happens to, public land use. Look at what all the great work that's done in Wisconsin of conserving and rehabilitating trout streams and trout habitat, things like that. That's all fed by dollars and cents from hunters, fishers, people that enjoy the outdoors. What's your take on that right now, that condensing numbers, both the importance of it, the trajectory that it's going, and how we as outdoors people can impact that?
Yeah. Well, so the first thing is that these projections were talked about and forecasted 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And for 30 years, we've been saying, that model that you were describing is going to have to change, or something's going to have to change. Otherwise, as you're describing, it's kind of on a dead end path, or it's not a great business plan. And so there's been a long, healthy discussion about what is the better strategy of, do we double down as that hunting population gets smaller? Is the only answer to increase their license fees, to keep up with the cost of operations at a stronger burden, to each of those individual, kind of a user pay system, as opposed to a broader sharing of the load, recognizing that there's a lot of non-hunters that benefit, from conservation, of course, and appreciate wildlife. But then there is that unknown and that threat that, well, if you have more different, diverse views at the table, is that going to water down and interfere with our objectives? And that's understandable, but that's evolving, either way. And so it does become, how do we create a platform where there's a more inclusive conversation to recognize that it's not one or the other, that it's not mutually exclusive. These things can play out, side by side. But so as it relates to that, again, 30 years ago, it was being forecast that what we're seeing play out right now is going to play out, and they weren't wrong. And it really simply comes down to demographics of our population. And at first we talked about it in terms of, well, it's just about the baby boomer generation. And that plays out in a lot of other arenas too, right? It's like, man, that baby boomer generation has such an impact by virtue of their size that as they are, aging out of participation or aging out of the population, they're not being backfilled. And that's part of it. But on the other end, the reason they're not being backfilled isn't just the age profile of our population. It's that, the younger kids these days, I think about, we talked about earlier, and when I came into this in the 70s and 80s, it was like the options of how you're going to spend your free time were not as many on the table and very appealing, to follow in the footsteps of your dad or your grandpa, your uncle, your mentors. And again, it was a very male-dominated, thing at that time. And one of the bright spots that we have seen over the past, 15 years is the growth of female participation for a number of different reasons, just for not beyond the sake of, hey, these are such cool experiences. We're just glad you get, you're welcomed and embracing it and enjoying it too. But we see very different age profile retainment of boys versus girls, in that they try it out and really well as a teenager, but we don't hang on to them, at the same rate we do hang on to male participants. But the other thing that's been interesting is, as you pointed out, the entry point doesn't have to be at 12 years old anymore, because it used to be dependent on you pass. It is, like you said, it's difficult, it's intimidating to get exposed, to get started. You need a mentor to show you the ropes. But now that can happen virtually, and you can, so we are seeing a lot of, adults that didn't grow up with the exposure that find it very attractive and appealing for a whole host of reasons, whether it's the food connection aspect of it or the spiritual connection, the land that we were talking about earlier. And that's great. So it is neat to see. So we will, for the foreseeable future, continue to have hundreds of thousands of people participating, and that's great. But if we go back to the specifics of deer and deer management, and what does it mean that we are losing? We peaked out at about 700,000 deer hunters at the turn of the century of 2000. And we've lost about 100,000 since then. So we're at 600,000 now. And so there's been a lot of, well, how do we stop that? How do we turn the corner or stabilize it? And the frank reality is the forecast is we're going to lose another 100,000 over the next 10 to 15 years. It's just, and there's more research going into why and how. And so you can put time and effort into, well, how do we build those numbers back up? Or you put time and effort into how do we make 500,000 deer hunters be as effective as 700,000 deer hunters in managing the deer population. And the people that want to quickly say, well, yeah, we're losing deer hunters because Wisconsin doesn't know how to manage deer and it's just gone bad. And wanting to pin it on something. And it's natural to say, to want to find a fix. It's like, if we just do this, we can stop this. And if they wouldn't have done this wouldn't have happened. But if you look at our other big whitetail states in the country, they're all feeling the same thing. It's playing out in Michigan at probably twice the rate that it's happening in Wisconsin, and some of the other big whitetail states like Ohio and Pennsylvania and a couple of the eastern states. So it's not something that any one state's policy is doing wrong that's turning hunters off. It's just these other factors that are really, frankly, aren't within our control. And they're just part of, cultural shifts that are happening. So all we can do is expose and share and have these conversations that will get people intrigued. And again, it can happen more effectively from folks like you mentioned, from the outside. Because if it comes from the agency, it comes with this baggage of, well, they have their own agenda. They're just trying to sell more licenses to keep the revenue coming in, and that you hear that narrative. And that's not the case at all, but it's understandable that people would think, well, that's our reason or our logic for going toward it. But so to me, it's been more that the challenge has been, okay, how do we maintain an aspect of deer management through deer hunting, which is the way it was always set up. And so that's where I think it's important to then go back to thinking about Wisconsin's non-hunting community, which is by far way bigger than the hunting community. As much as this is again, we said, it's part of our fabric, it's a big deal in Wisconsin, and that's great. We still are a pretty small chunk of the total population, but we enjoy general support from the whole population.
Mm-hmm.
But we kind of take that for granted. And so that's where I think as our portion of the population gets smaller as per capita, again, if we were 700,000, now we're 600,000. If we're going to be 500,000, from a policy development standpoint, we're going to lose ground proportionally, and we become more dependent on that non-hunting community to see us as an asset and continue to say, yeah, we want them to be vibrant and robust. We want to keep that going. I don't have any interest in participating, but I'm cool with what they're doing as long as I see the upside to it. And so that goes back to that hunting for your community as opposed to just for yourself, because we could be in a position. And then when I talk to some of my colleagues from other states out east, that's where and that, as is the case with a lot of things in culture, for us in the Midwest, if you want to see your future, look to the coasts, right? And so we can look to what's going on out east and go, that could be us, and X number of years, if this goes on. And so when you see some of their conversations about, we're looking at 5 to 10 years from now, recreational deer hunting is not going to be the mechanism by which we can say we are quote unquote managing deer. And some would reasonably make that argument now that we're not managing the deer population. And so what does management mean? And I've had some interesting philosophical conversations with folks about, is the word management a crutch or a problem, because the word management insinuates control. It's like we are in control of the outcome and we just have to do this, turn this dial, do that, change this policy, and we can shape the outcome. When in reality, a lot of the things that shape the trajectory of where things are going are independent and outside of the realm of what we can quote unquote manage. And so understanding that helps with this, when we talked about earlier about expectations. If there's this expectation that, well, if you just do this, this will happen, or if you would just do this, it'll go back to the way it was, that creates an expectation that unfortunately probably isn't realistic. And so you need to have a different conversation of these are the factors to be aware of, that look at timber markets, look at land use pattern changes, that if you objectively look at our history, as much as deer hunting is such a high profile thing and we embrace it and enjoy it, and it's a great part of Wisconsin, it creates this well, we somehow made this happen. We're really been the benefactors of just other things really that influenced land use patterns on the landscape. Deer are a product of the land and changes on the landscape, and deer flourish in areas of disturbance on the landscape. And so to the degree that things happened on the landscape that were done not with deer in mind, but with agriculture in mind or forestry in mind, or, name whatever you want in terms of monetizing or making money off the land and all the things we've done, some of them have just been incidentally very beneficial to deer. And that was, again, recognized 100 years ago by Aldo Leopold. Mm-hmm. So those concepts, we've known for a long time. But again, we still carry this presumption that we are, building the road as to where this is going, when I think in reality, our expectations, our responsibility should be, no, our job is to keep the car on the road.
We're the guardrails.
Yeah. And when it goes in the ditch, we're there to help get it back on the road. Mm-hmm. But the idea that we get to build the road to where we want to go, probably again sets up false expectations that will end up being unrealized and then generates frustration. And so, those are the kind of conversations I think we, need to be having in the future, to keep this rolling. And I think we will. I am optimistic, and for reasons like you said, the platforms and the conversations that are happening now are exposing people to these different ideas, and it's not just the way Grandpa told us it should be. And that's great. I'm a historian with this stuff. I love the 1940s deer literature and seeing how things happened then. And when I read that, some of it is just like, oh my gosh, you could take this paragraph out of this 1940s passage in the Vilas County newspaper that was ridiculing the DNR and plug it in to last year's column, and it's the exact same paragraph.
Yeah, super true. How does access play into it? I think it's super interesting because talking about like the dichotomy between far north Wisconsin and crop and farm country, that's obviously it leads to two different deer herds, like managed differently. But when we think about when I think about hunters starting hunting, success is important. Like if somebody just starting hunting, spends a lot of time in the woods and doesn't see many, they're going to maybe be more likely to become a little bit not as passionate about it or not understand it. And that's one thing. Actually, Doug Duran has a cool thing that he's bringing to share the land of increasing access to that type of environment. And I just wonder how that plays a part in it, because like if I forecast the trajectory of someone that's going to start hunting big woods deer in northern Wisconsin, and that's their first experience of how their hunt goes. And then maybe someone has another experience, maybe through something like Doug's Share the Land, where, you know, you pitch in on somebody's property and do some work for a little while, and what do you know? You have access to some farmland of where the deer herd is different. Your expectations of a hunter are dramatically different, where you can go out and say, I'll probably see 10 deer tonight. Is it going to be the 10 deer that I want to see?
Yeah.
As opposed to like, I'm going to trounce through a couple miles of big woods, try to find some sign, and I might get on one today. Two different experiences. Access is a lot easier in the big woods in Wisconsin than it is to farm country, and where there is public access in that country, it's usually a little bit more heavily pressured, which brings in the other part of that conversation of, I think some people are timid to even go on public land because of pressure. Other experiences with hunters, people like to think that, you know, public land means different things. Like, this is my little section of public land.
Yeah.
So how does access play into that conversation about increasing and decreasing hunter numbers and the trajectory we're on, do you think?
Yeah. It plays a big role in as much as in past surveys the agency has done, again, with the social dimensions and actually interviewing people that we see in their license purchasing records, you know, that they don't anymore, and you follow up, well, why? Access comes up, you know, pretty high on that list. And so, yeah, some of this transition that happened, I mentioned earlier over the decades that we saw a pretty big shift in the 1990s. And what happened in the 1990s was this combination of, we had this real big boom in the deer population. Again, due to factors that we didn't create, we were just the benefactors of it. But we saw this really growing deer population and really growing interest along with it, which was great, and growing participation. That was wonderful. But even back then, I can find plenty of people that were not experiencing that, you know. But what happened in the 90s was the combination of that really, you know, growing deer population, growing interest in deer hunting, that expanded during that time outside of the traditional firearm deer season. We really saw that growth going on too. We also had a really booming economy that put a lot of people in the position to say, I really am into this and I want to secure my own little piece of heaven. And we saw a tremendous amount of land transfer happen in the 90s of what was the idle, unproductive agricultural land became highly sought after and valued recreational land. And so that, one of those shifts, again, there's all kinds of situations that wouldn't fit this model, but in general, what we saw was a lot of, you know, farmland deer cover that had experienced this tremendous growth in the 80s and 90s that, you know, used to be accessed by 12, 20 people, and they would drive it on after opening day. It would get pushed multiple times. Now it's owned by a couple of guys that are trying to create a different experience. And that chunk of land that used to facilitate, you know, a dozen people, you know, now maybe facilitates 4 people or something of that nature. And the collective effect of that really shifted, again, access to the you know, what would be considered the optimal places. Again, especially in the farmland. Going back to the history of, you know, again, when the baby boomers were kids and they were coming into deer hunting and they just followed their dads and grandpas and uncles, and in that era, the deer were on these big blocks of public land. That's where you went to go deer hunting, because it wasn't very good in the farmland in the 60s. And heck, in the 50s, it was closed in a lot of the southern half of the state. You know, and it went to alternate years and stuff like that. And so that idea of, you went to the big block public lands and industrial forest lands, and you know, that's where the deer hunting happened. That was very true in that period of time. But then as that also was shifting, because in the 80s and 90s, it started really getting good in the other landscapes. And so we saw this big shift of opportunity, and the deer population itself flourishing on the landscape that was more dominated by private land. And as, again, things out of our control in terms of recreation and deer hunting, think of how agricultural everything in Wisconsin has gone through dramatic changes. And parts of that, include land ownership, the parcelization off of the non-productive lands for recreational properties, and then the consolidation of productive land into bigger, corporate operations. That all has an impact on access to those properties that has changed a lot over time. And so as those two scenarios you were describing, and I live in both of them, where I hunt in the farmland, that's where I live. It's convenient, it's easy. I can go there with a reasonable expectation that I'm going to see deer. I relish my northern forest experience because, seeing a deer and getting a deer is a thrill, in the north. And again, it's easy for me to say, and if I don't see deer, I don't get a deer up north, so be it, because I feel pretty good that I'm going to have that chance, later in the season when I go back home. But for the folks that live and breathe the northern forest experience and experienced that boom, the bubble in the 90s and early 2000s, which was a very specific small period of time, but became the new high water mark, of course, right? And everybody that's still around remembers that, and understandably, how do we get back to that? And that's where, if you understand that how we got there in the first place was pretty circumstantial, and it was a window of time that existed, and it's like, be grateful you were there to experience it. But the arrows that were pointing towards making that happen aren't pointed in that direction anymore for a number of different reasons. And so the objective to say, what can we do to get back to the way things were 20 years ago up north, is unfortunately, I think, fraught with frustration, because it's just the powers that made that happen aren't lined up that way right now. And so,
what were some of those? What were some of those that made that boom?
Well, it was the combination of prior decades of land use. Again, the forestry strategies. Really, you have to go all the way back to the late 1800s and the great, pinery harvest days where they slicked off the north. And that happened in a pretty short window of time, where the lumber barons just exploited the heck out of, and people would say just devastated, that landscape. But those landscapes are resilient if given the chance. And so what you had was the major clearing, from the late 1800s to 1910, 1920, and then as that fizzled, came to an end, which it was going to, that was followed by the 30s, which was the drought. Nationally, you hear about the Dust Bowl days and all that type of stuff. So you had all of that slash left over from the timber stuff, and so it was just wildfires that just kept that landscape pretty barren. And then you get to post-World War II, and the combination of, all right, that drought cycle's over, and the development of wildfire control that the DNR, developed with forestry, suppressing wildfire. Boom, that creates this window for that landscape to flush up and recover with young growth. And had that all not played out, there never would have been this heritage of the great going deer hunting up north. It all just happened because of those things. And then it probably would have fizzled out or faded earlier, but then the paper mill industry kept that going, because paper mills' demand for hardwood pulp, to make paper, created deer habitat. And so that's where the industrial forests of central Wisconsin and up north, again, it wasn't done for deer and to create deer habitat. We were just the benefactors of it, because they were regularly going back in and disturbing those areas and managing those forests for early age stuff that deer and grouse and those kind of things liked. And then, so, volume of paper mill pulp consumption kind of peaked in the 1980s. And as we've seen, how this has changed over the last decades, those paper mills, their markets changed, the demands have changed, a bunch of paper mills have closed. And so those lands aren't being disturbed at the same level. They still are. And a lot of people will say, I've seen plenty of clear cutting going on. And yes, it is happening, thankfully, but not at the scale, that it was happening in the 70s and the 80s. And then what sustained this even a little bit longer was the mild winters that's really started in the late 80s. And we had mild winter after mild winter after mild winter, which when it really comes down to it in the northern part of Wisconsin, and the same thing for Minnesota and Michigan, winter is the final deciding common denominator. And so that period of time in the late 80s and early 90s, we had a couple severe winters sprinkled in there. Similar to what we do now, we have more mild winters than severe winters, but that situation in the late 80s, early 90s was what really led to that, the deer population. Just Aldo Leopold would have described it as an eruption, and he saw those play out in the 1920s and 30s, in the far west when he was down in the southwest states, in Arizona and New Mexico, and the landscape, the things that happened there, and it ties back to his experience with the objective of predator eradication in the objective of enhancing game populations, which that's a whole nother conversation of the role. And that's where his epiphany came to the thought of, if we got rid of the predators, that's great for us, great for the deer and great for us. And that was true only to a certain extent until the population of deer without having that controlling factor, in his description, what he would call was an eruption. And then he came to Wisconsin and he saw that playing out in northern Wisconsin, back in the 40s. But then we experienced it again in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. And that carried on through, in the early 2000s. And again, from a deer management perspective and the lessons that Aldo Leopold taught us, we were coming at it with we need to reduce the deer population purposefully, or it's going to happen naturally, and it's going to be uglier, if it happens naturally, or than if we can kind of mitigate it and mediate it. And that's where we would get into the battle between us and the hunters of, we think you should take more antlerless deer. And they're understandably would be like, well, no, that seems like it would be a defeat, be a negative on our future. And, we've always, the mantra within the wildlife management community for, again, going all the way back to Leopold's time was, but much as you'd like to, you cannot stockpile deer on the landscape.
Yeah.
And the challenge up north is it's a bit of a roll of the dice, or that you don't know if the upcoming winter is going to be hard on them or not. And so what you do in the fall during the hunting season leading up to that, there's this, it's not necessarily intuitive to say, if you knew you're going to have a hard winter, the best thing you could do for that deer population is harvest more of them in the fall, so that there was fewer mouths to feed as they got through the winter, and they would be in better condition, come spring. And then because of that, they'll be more productive when it comes to fawning season, as opposed to sending too many of them into that winter. You're going to lose a bunch anyhow for other reasons, and they're not going to be in your freezer. And the ones that do survive are going to be in poorer condition. And, that makes sense biologically, but from the human nature side of it, it's just like, it's hard to reconcile that idea of, if I'm killing them and now instead of saving them to help them get through. So again, it's a really important, but it's a conversation we've been having for 100 years.
Yeah.
And we'll probably continue to have. Yeah.
For sure. And I think that opens up the door to the next piece of that, of what could be that next scale tipping thing, or, deer harvest numbers versus health. And that's, the impending, or not even impending, the current state of CWD in the state. Yeah. Depending how that evolves, I'm really excited to hear your thoughts about it. But the North is set up to better handle the spread of CWD than what right now most would consider the ideal scenario of like Southwest Wisconsin. It's hard to forecast where that's going to go. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. What, the North is set up better for that. I doubt the scales completely invert or whatever, but how is that? What's the current state of that spread in your view? And how is that going to affect the deer population and deer management in the next, 10 to 20 years?
Yeah, no, you're right. That's a very important question. And it is very challenging. And in terms of that forecast of how is it going to play out, there are, again, variables that are embedded in the landscape and land cover and distribution of habitats that leads to distribution in deer differences. And so, yeah, what it really, in my mind, what it does come down to, as would be the case with any, kind of disease management protocols or mitigation, is higher animal densities lead to higher disease spread and contracting, et cetera. And so the way we've kind of described and tracked, chronic wasting disease in Wisconsin is prevalence of the disease, both where it is, but then the prevalence of the disease. In other words, the proportion of the population that has the disease. And so some very important work came out of that, a long study in Southwest Wisconsin, where the long and the short of it is what they were able to capture was what chronic wasting disease does at the population level, not just at the individual animal level, is shortens lifespans. Based on those animals that become infected are going to die from it. There's no two ways about it. And so what you're talking about is taking, the adult doe portion of the population and saying, how many of these does are going to live to be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5? And in those peak production years of, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, fewer of them are going to make it there. And so at a certain point, essentially, and it won't necessarily look exactly the same in different parts of Wisconsin, because as you were alluding to, it may not play out this way in northern Wisconsin, because you may never get to those deer densities. As much as people would like to say, I want more deer, I think what you were just saying is it may indirectly benefit the north and other parts of the state, where it's like, the deer densities you have are not going to allow CWD to play out the way we've seen it play out. And that's why we see it differently. Like in the Western, a lot of people will talk about, they've had CWD since the 1960s out West, and it hasn't had an impact. Well, it has. But you also are talking about landscapes that have, 5 to 10 animals per square mile. They're easier to find and see because of the open landscape. And so people are, I can go out there and see all kinds of them. Well, they're just more visible because of that landscape. But so what we saw down in that area, and what this research has shown, is that when the adult doe population hits a certain level of prevalence, that 29-30% of them are infected, that proportion of the adult doe population dying due to CWD will start having a negative impact on the productivity of the herd. So when it hits that level, you're going to start to see population decline, which again, when this all started 22, 24 years ago, I'm going to do my math, some of the prognosticators then that were, animal population specialists, and of course they're just operating with models, not knowing what might have happened. I remember, back in 2002, 2003, folks from the University of Wisconsin saying it's going to take 20 plus years for you to actually see the effect of this. And bam, if that isn't exactly what happened. And so to the question of what does it look like in the future, in the areas of the state where it does have the opportunity to develop that level of prevalence, you're going to see fewer and younger animals on the landscape. It's just going to be, and then as that happens, though, then prevalence starts to drop. And so you'll end up, CWD is not going to cause the eradication of deer on the landscape. It's, Doug Duran and I have talked about this for a number of years, and some people aren't old enough to get the analogy, but I liken chronic wasting disease to be the Dutch elm disease of deer. We still have elm trees. We just don't have as many, and they don't grow as old or as big unless they're really isolated. And there, some of that, could be the impact that we see, on chronic wasting disease on the landscape. And so we'll have a younger population that's turning over faster, which will be more like the deer population we had in the 1980s when we did it intentionally. And so Dan Storm, the lead researcher on that project, as he summarized, that aspect of the research. And there's been a bunch of other really interesting spin-offs, but the takeaway, again, at least for that landscape, not necessarily transferable to others, but it is that if you don't manage your deer population, CWD is going to manage it for you. And that's a falls in line with the general principles of any wildlife population and that's where we look at human harvest and hunting and its role within the bigger mortality picture of any population. Our idea of wildlife management or game management is that you conduct your human harvest within the realms of that portion of the mortality of that population that's sustainable. And it's the same, we could talk about this with deer up north too. It's like if you don't harvest them through human harvest, that mortality factor is going to be there one way or the other. It's just going to shift to something else. And in the end, a population that is chronically overly dense for the landscape, it is typically disease. That's going to be the common factor. That's the equalizer, I guess. And whether it's and there's a lot of those scenarios that play out with other species. And so, yeah, again, to me, it does come down, and that's where here in Northeast Wisconsin, we can look to Southwest Wisconsin and go, is that our future? And is there something we can do to have that not be our future? And unfortunately, the answer is yes, reduce your deer population. But to the average deer hunter that was faced with that 20 years ago, it was like understandable. Like, well, you're telling me either I reduce the deer population intentionally or it's going to be reduced anyhow. Why wouldn't I take my chances and just see what happens and not do it intentionally? But usually the fallout from letting it happen naturally is a worse outcome than having done it under, against the realm of management. So
yeah, so whatever semblance of control that we have, it loses all of it because that happens. Yeah, that's super interesting. And back to Doug's project there, Share the Land. The first thing I thought of in that scenario, and there's a lot of differing opinions on, there's a word for it that's escaping my mind right now, but like large livestock operations, stuff like that. That access where there's a bunch of deer, like there's big old farms throughout the state that always have work to be done. And then that can it can be this, quadruple edged sword of like access happens and people who want to get into hunting have a good opportunities at deer. We manage these populations in the areas of livestock and agriculture that have a higher prevalence of CWD or a higher risk factor of CWD. It seems like this, not silver bullet, but it seems like a good answer that could but it could help mitigate the results of a lot of different problems if, a certain bowling ball was pushed in the right direction. I don't know. That was just my read on it. So it's fascinating to hear all that stuff. But sticking on the CWD conversation, one of the things that I've found interesting about it is since I started hunting in the mid-90s, I remember the CWD conversation actually being larger than it is now. And I think maybe if appetites have been just satiated by it, that it's just like, 20 years of talking about CWD, maybe people are just tired of talking about it or something. But as you said, it doesn't just poof, gone. It's not just going to go away. And it's interesting to me that it seems like the conversation is a bit leaner than it was at one point. Is that just my perception, or is that the reality of what we face today? Is there less overall conversation from the hunting community about CWD in Wisconsin?
I think that's probably accurate in as much as there is some degree of, CWD burnout. You've been talking about this now for 25 years, and in many people's situations, I haven't really seen anything different yet because, they're not dealing with it. And then in the area where they are, that really strong conversation that was happening in the early years, did spin off of, there was recognized right out of the gate that, hey, we maybe have a chance to squash this out. But the only, and it's not like it's going to happen, but the only chance to possibly do it is going to be pretty extreme and pretty radical. And we'll never know, if if it would have been possible, because we did start down that path, and it quickly met with a lot of opposition, which isn't a surprise. And there's a lot of parallels when you get into these conversations of, whether it's the approach towards chronic wasting disease. We saw it play out with COVIDs and vaccines. We see it play out with climate change, all those kind of things. It's fraught with that, well, you're going to pick one side or the other,
Yeah.
and then go there. And so the challenge we had with CWD fell right into that too. And so we did get, pretty strong pushback, that again, it was like the medicine feels worse than the disease. So let's just roll the dice and see what happens, as opposed to you guys coming in and from their perception was like ruining deer hunting for the next 10 to 20 years. We don't know, because you're going to try to, knock the population back that far. So there's still a memory of that, 20 years later, that, there was this pretty radical approach. But we were on the cutting edge then, and there was a lot of unknowns, and what was known about the disease out west, frankly, is what got us to just start looking, in the 1990s. And it was in Wisconsin and the other states. And it just so happened that factors will never know why, we were the unfortunate ones where things were set up. And there's probably, as we look back now and we see how CWD spreads on the landscape, incidentally, by human activities, that this was probably going on well before we knew it. But so this goes back to the whole awareness and discussion of herd densities, and the analogy there with CWD, and we see it now in the state, where if you think about a grass fire and the leading edge of that fire, and then there's always sparks, and depending on the sparks blowing out and landing ahead of the fire, and depending on what that spark lands on, it may go out or it may ignite, and that's what really, in the big picture happened in Wisconsin. A spark of CWD landed on 100 deer per square mile. And it was just, that was a plate. Whereas some of those sparks in other parts of the state, are landing on something that, it's less than that. And there's a chance that spark goes out. And that's, again, comes to the argument of you might be better, and going back to what you said earlier about, hey, having 10, 15 deer per square mile across the north, you may decades from now be awful glad that was the case when you see the landscape of where CWD is and isn't.
Yeah, could be fascinating to see, like, depending on, it's hard to prognosticate what will happen, but maybe, right now it's kind of, Southwest you can be priced out of paradise as a hunter, right? Like, there's all these big bucks there. The land prices are through the roof. Mm-hmm. Northern Wisconsin, you can still get, $1,500 an acre. You get a nice little chunk of property. 20 years from now, you don't know what's going to happen. These things flip, and it'll just be interesting to see. But I don't know, that conversation is really fascinating. I'm going to close this curtain a little bit so the sun doesn't get in your eyes.
Oh, sure. I was so into it that I wasn't noticing. But
Hour and 20.
Okay, cool. That's the best part about podcasts, man. You don't get up on live TV and adjust the curtain, but
yeah,
podcasts you do. Man, so that's a lot about deer. I figured we'd get down in the rabbit hole for a while. Something we're both obviously passionate about, and it's fun to talk about, but it matters a lot. All those things that we talk about matters a lot. But the core of hunter participation in conversation is, or conservation is just really important, I think, to maintaining the piece of our culture that we have it as. It's really important.
Yeah, it is for a number of reasons, as you brought up earlier, in terms of it is the lion's share of conservation funding that affects and benefits a lot more than deer. I mean, that money goes into the conservation fund that gets used collectively by wildlife and law enforcement and the department's, frontline staff, for, public information. And then, deer are carrying a lot of water for a lot of other species that benefit from, the funding mechanism that's generated there. But then again, the non-hunting community, indirectly benefits a lot from deer hunting, not only from the conservation work that happens, but to the degree that they can, manage a deer population that may, limit crop damage or may limit, car accidents or other issues other impacts that people feel. And one could make the argument that, we could do better in those realms for that population. But going back to the access question, there's, especially in southeast Wisconsin, there's a lot of deer causing a lot of issues for people, but they're living in areas that aren't accessible to hunters, period. And not that it has to be that way, but there's understandably, with that level of residential development on the landscape, a lack of comfort, with firearm deer hunting. And that's why we see counties like, basically all the counties in the greater Milwaukee area now are harvesting more deer with archery equipment than they are with firearm equipment. But that understandable uncomfort with firearm hunting and deer harvest is a challenge, because that is by far the more efficient way to harvest deer, and can be done effectively and safely in amongst residential developments. And again, that's like something we're seeing playing out more in the eastern states, where they are demonstrating that.
Isn't that something that happens in Illinois a lot, like a shotgun only zones?
Well, some of the states, still do have that. We had that in Wisconsin. I forget how many years ago. It's been long enough I forget, but we were shotgun only in the southern half of the state.
Okay.
Under the premise that high-powered rifles, because a bullet can travel unimpeded much further, imposed a bigger risk. But when you took the practical approach of how those weapons are used and when and what the scenarios are, it's extraordinarily rare, for that weapon to be discharged in a manner that bullet's going to go very far either way. And so there was some research actually in Pennsylvania decades ago where they were already in that situation of, hey, we got to figure out how we're going to manage these deer populations that are exploding in and amongst people in residential areas, and recognizing archery harvest probably just isn't going to cut it or keep up. So which firearms are the best ones to be used? And there's this assumption that shotguns are safer than rifles because in the end, the bullet can't travel as far and not as fast. But in reality, when they looked at the differences, because of ballistics, because of the mass of the bullet, the size and weight of it that comes out of a shotgun, a slug, versus a rifle bullet, those shotgun slugs may be traveling slower, but they are much more able to, because of their size, retain energy after they hit something. And whether that hit something is pass through a deer, pass through a tree limb, bounce off the ground, they were more likely to cause damage to something else that it hits incidentally. Whereas a rifle bullet, it could goes way faster, it could go further, but because of the size and shape of that bullet, when it hits something, it loses its energy. And so that concept right there and that realization is what allowed Pennsylvania and then Wisconsin to go, maybe the perception of these shotgun only, from a safety perspective, is maybe based on perceptions again. And so we went away from that quite a while ago. Minnesota just dropped their shotgun only restrictions in a big chunk, if not all of the southern half of the more open country. And we've seen some other different developments in a few of the other states, like, straight wall cartridges. But again, that's under the idea that these firearms don't discharge a bullet as fast that would travel as far. But especially if you were to put something in, like it's mandatory to shoot from an elevated platform and you're shooting down, that takes away, almost all. And then you simply look at the track record over the past, 20 years, 30 years, because of the great work that's been done in our hunter education classes and with those volunteers. And of course, we track it in terms of accidents related to people, injuries or fatalities. There's a lot of other things that can happen with bullets, again, buildings being struck or other things like that. And the rate of that stuff has gone way, way down. Mm-hmm. And so that's great. And that's really one of the positive things of development in deer hunting that hopefully would allow some people in parts of this. And if you look at just this last gun season and we look at the real productive counties that were killing, 4, 5, 6 deer per square mile, and then you go down into the southeast counties that still have a whole bunch of deer, and they're killing 1 to 1.5 deer per square mile. It's not because the deer aren't there. It's because the hunters can't get at them.
Yeah.
So that's where the non-hunting community and landowners that do recognize we got a deer population issue here, that maybe they could, embrace the hunting community and provide access in areas that traditionally have been thought, well, yeah, no, this is not a place, we don't want people hunting here.
Mm-hmm.
But then they come to the government going, what are you going to do about these deer at the cost to the taxpayers in general, in a different mechanism by when it could be like, well, maybe there's a win-win here where we could maybe, open up some access. And a lot of communities are doing that within their green spaces, where they think they can do so safely. And we certainly see some communities, really providing, especially with archery, because that's the first step of comfort level. But there's other places where maybe we can open some of this up to firearm harvest, because the alternative is we're going to have to hire professional contractors to come in and do it. Yeah.
Which is wild. Yeah. It makes me think, you mentioned Southeast Wisconsin. I won't say his name because I asked him to be on the podcast, but he doesn't want any more exposure for obvious reasons. There's a guy down in Southeast Wisconsin that he's a photographer and a videographer, and he goes in and gets these videos of these massive bucks that he can get super close to because they're like little sanctuaries.
Mm-hmm.
They're in these places that people can't hunt. And I'm sure there are just so many hunters that watch his stuff and just drool over the opportunity of these. And say what you will about it, it's a little different thing. It's certainly not chasing a buck in the big woods of northern Wisconsin. That it's a whole different ball game. But still, those deer would benefit from being managed by us. I mean, I keep hearing your message, and it's so true that we don't pave the way, we're the guardrails of the road. But at the same time, I see that guy's stuff all the time, and I'm like, man, there are 2,000 hunters just looking at this, just wanting to know where he is. And I think that's why he doesn't want to be on the podcast. He doesn't he doesn't need any more publicity. You get videos of these, but yeah, that's such a, man, in some ways I envy, and in some ways I don't envy the role you've had for the past 5 years, because from a problem solving aspect, it's really fun to think about this stuff and what are the levers you can pull and how can these go. But on the flip side of the coin, it's going back to expectations you talked about earlier, having the expectations of what can and can't we impact, and what are the guardrails that we can do are fascinating. So I guess maybe let's end on this. What's next for you? You don't spend 5 years of solving these problems and just living, eating, and breathing this, and tomorrow be like, okay, I'm going to take up bowling. What's next for you as you by the time this episode drops, you'll be officially retired and off the payroll. So what's next for you? Yeah,
well, I think it's, as I get advice from a lot of my already retired colleagues, it would say just take a step back and reset, rewire. But I definitely am still really intrigued and compelled about the challenges, that are faced in the things that I've been exposed to. And I really enjoy sharing information, not from a realm of I'm smarter than you and I know stuff you don't know and now I'm going to enlighten you. It's more of a, man, I want you to understand this so you can have a frame of mind that allows you to embrace and enjoy your experience within the realm of the realities, as opposed to going through this with this frustration and a sense of, that this is, it's bad or it's negative, but it's based on presumptions that, if we have discuss this a little bit differently, and maybe it'll just help people with a little bit of a reset. Again, both the hunting community and the non-hunting community, because there is this sense of, well, this is always the way it's been, and this is always the way it will be or should be, and change is hard for everybody. But I, to the degree I can help. And so I guess the bottom line to the answer is I've enjoyed communicating, say the word communicate and stumble over it. That doesn't make sense. That's not very good, but conversations, I just, I'm not done with doing that. I just don't know necessarily what that might look like in the future, what the platform is, and that's okay. It's kind of exciting to see how that unfolds. And so, yeah, I've one way or the other, and people that know me well, I think will hope that I continue to find other venues. Otherwise, they're just going to have to listen to me ad nauseum, overload on it. So I got to find those outlets.
Yeah. I feel that. Probably a little bit more time in the field too, right?
Yeah, I will. I have to admit, spring is a busy time of year in this role, so I'm looking forward to turkey hunting and steelhead fishing, without that sense of, I really should be doing this instead. And then, the deer camp that I have been privileged to be part of, it's not mine, but I'm invited, and I hunt during the gun season up in Vilas County, and it's like, I don't have to go home Sunday afternoon. I am going to spend a few more days, in the Northwoods and having that experience, and hopefully the better chances of tracking snow on the landscape and the space to go and get on a deer track and follow it, which that's just an experience that, again, and more and more people are talking, having those experiences, talking and sharing it, which I think is going to, when people say, how can we see a renaissance in the North? It's not going to be because, the deer population doubled and everyone's going to come back, because even if you double the deer population in the North, it's still half of what the deer population is going to be in the South. So from that opportunity standpoint of where am I going to spend my time, you're not going to necessarily lure people back with volume of deer. You're going to lure them up there with an experience that they can't get, in the southern Wisconsin landscape.
Absolutely. Full circle moment. The experience I was talking about why I go outside anyway. That's what you can find in the northern Wisconsin. You better have your phone charged and your GPS ready because you can get some places where it gets a little funky and you got to make sure you can get home, and that's a different experience than it is walking across the cornfield to the tower blind. And it's, and nothing against either one. It's just different. And I think I completely agree that's not lost up north. That's more alive than it ever has been.
I do have the opportunity. Right. You're exactly right. And those people are interacting with me, but those people aren't the ones that are going to show up at a public meeting to express their dissatisfaction with things. And they very quietly are just like, I'm okay that other people have this perception that it's lousy up here. I'm loving it. But they're not going to be real vocal about that. And again, some people are, but, and that's that space thing. I mean, the public land hunter that I talk to, that is, I'd call them the successful public land hunters. The common denominators are mobile. Yeah. It's like, no, don't just keep doing the same thing every year and get in there, recognize that things change from year to year. The deer were over here last year, but they're not this year. If you go back there because you really like that spot. I did that myself. One of my other big changes now that I got more time is scout more, find more options, because I fell into that same trap where I had a spot. I really liked it. I found it. I was successful there once. And then I just kept going back there because it's going to happen again. It's going to happen again. I know it is. And it took about 4 years of like, it doesn't seem to be happening again. It's time to do something different. And that should be part of what hunting is all about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, it was great chatting with you, Jeff.
Yeah.
I appreciate you coming in.
Thanks for the opportunity.
I wish you the best of luck on your next step. And thanks for 5 years of solid work in helping us to all hunters, helping us navigate tumultuous territories in a lot of different ways, from public opinion to CWD, herd numbers, all of that stuff. Just appreciate your time, man.
Thanks, Brad. I feel grateful that I'm at a point where it is. I candidly, when I took the job 5 years ago, I was like, this could end really badly or could end well. And I was like, it's 50-50. And again, just like we think about deer, some of the factors that could cause that are outside of our control. It could have been no fault of our own, but it's, political winds change or something else happens. And so that's where, and I was in a kind of a position where, I'm a little more insulated from, hey, if things don't go well, I don't have 20 years ahead of me yet that I got to try to reinvent myself. So yeah, no, thanks. I appreciate it. I'm glad I was able to do what I could, and now I do have to reinvent myself.
It'll be fun though.
Anyhow, yeah.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yep, you bet, Brad.